Chapter 31. Her Contributions. After the white tablet entered her mouth, it immediately emitted a refreshing, cool sensation. Her itching throat seemed to be wrapped in fresh water, and it felt much better. Mrs. Olson swallowed the tablet without drinking water. She started coughing again. She smiled bitterly. Just now, for a fleeting moment, she almost thought the tablet was working. What a wishful thinking. Mrs. Olson lay in bed and closed her eyes. She had been dealing with chronic neurotic coughing for over 2 decades. She had taken numerous medicines and consulted so many experts over the years, but it hadn't gotten any better.
Shirley, wake up.
Mrs. Olson slowly opened her eyes and saw Taylor standing next to her bed, the entire room bright as day. Were the hospital's incandescent lights so bright? Feeling a bit confused, she asked,
"What time is it?"
10 in the morning.
Taylor looked at her anxiously.
You should eat something, or else your blood sugar will drop.
Mrs. Olson was stunned. She turned her head in confusion. Only then did she notice that the light in the room wasn't coming from the lamps, but from the sunlight. She actually slept through the whole night. How could that be possible? It must be that bottle of medicine, the one Keira gave her. Aunt South, who was next to her, was so excited that she had tears in her eyes.
Ma'am, the sleeping pill the doctor gave you yesterday really worked. You actually slept for a full 10 hours.
Mrs. Olson was astounded.
What sleeping pills?
Aunt South looked toward Isla.
Mr. J got them for you. He heard that you were having trouble sleeping, so he specifically found a strong sleeping pill and added it to the medicine you were taking. We didn't tell you because we were afraid that if you kept thinking about it, you would have even more trouble sleeping. We didn't expect it to work this well.
Mrs. Olson hesitated. Was that so? But sleeping pills only aid sleep. When she woke up today, she clearly felt that her throat was much clearer. Her gaze fell on the pillow next to her, where the plastic bottle without a label was. She would try it again tonight. If she only took sleeping pills and not this medicine, she would then know which one actually worked. Thinking this, Mrs. Olson fell silent. Meanwhile, Taylor looked toward Isla and spoke with relief.
My son-in-law is amazing. I heard that there was a major flu outbreak recently, and the inpatient department is full. They couldn't find a vacant ward yesterday, and it was Jake who pulled a lot of strings to arrange this one. We are really grateful to him.
Only then did Mrs. Olson find out that the ward was also arranged by Jake.
He's such a good kid.
Seizing upon the moment, Isla said,
Mom, since Jake is so kind, you should help him too.
Mrs. Olson asked.
How can I help?
Taylor thought of something and said,
Is there some difficulty Jake faces at work?
Isla nodded, sighing.
His family wants Jake to manage the R&D department, but the researchers there are all senior and not very obedient to Jake. If we could invite Dr. South there, even just as an external technical support, then Jake could stabilize his position.
Having said that, Isla looked toward Mrs. Olson. As she expected, she saw struggle and hesitation on Mrs. Olson's face. Mrs. Olson has her own principles in dealing with people and matters. She didn't like to exploit kindness to seek benefits, but she was even more afraid of owing favors. Mrs. Olson hesitated a moment, then finally said,
I'll ask Dr. South. But if he doesn't agree, then let it be.
A smile spread across Isla's face.
Great!
Based on her experience, whenever Mrs. Olson asked for something, Dr. South never refused. Mrs. Olson took out her phone, found Dr. South on WhatsApp, carefully chose her words, and sent a message.
South, do you have a minute? I have a favor to ask.
When Keira received this message, she had just brought old Mrs. Horton back up from a walk. She read the message with a frown. Why did Mrs. Olson suddenly contact her? Was there an issue? Was there something wrong with yesterday's drugs? Or did it have an allergic reaction? That drug was actually still in the clinical trial stage, and she had originally planned to wait for the trial to end before giving it to Mrs. Olson. However, seeing Mrs. Olson's severe condition, she took it out in advance. Anxious, Keira asked the nursing staff to bring old Mrs. Horton back to her ward and headed for Mrs. Olson's ward in a hurry. Lewis, who was working in the outer office area, saw his grandmother walk in. He instinctively looked behind her but didn't see that slender figure. His eyes flickered.
"Where's Miss Olson?"
Old Mrs. Horton replied.
"She's gone to see her mother."
Lewis raised an eyebrow.
"Did something happen to Mrs. Olson?"
Old Mrs. Horton immediately became anxious.
"My granddaughter-in-law indeed rushed over just now." "Oh, you rat. Hurry up and check on her."
Lewis pursed his lips. After a moment of contemplation, he rose to his feet. Tom followed him in a hurry. Keira ran into Mrs. Olson's ward, only to find the ward was filled with many people. Not only was Jake there, but even Poppy was present. Somebody must have said something because everyone was laughing. However, the merriment quickly died when she stepped into the room. Keira stood at the doorway, feeling rather unnecessary. Mrs. Olson seemed all right. She lowered her head and was ready to leave. Mrs. Olson wanted to stop her, but seeing all the people in the room, she knew it was best for Keira to leave for now. They could meet alone when there was time. Poppy, however, opened her mouth.
Hey, isn't that Miss Olson? Are we not good enough for you now that you've cozied up to old Mrs. Horton?
Keira didn't respond and turned to leave, but Poppy grabbed her.
I heard you're trying your best to please old Mrs. Horton, staying by her bedside all night and doing all sorts of unpleasant chores. Do you think she'll consider you as close as their own kin? What kind of daydream are you having? You are nothing but a plaything to them.
Isla hastily said.
Don't say that. Old Mrs. Horton really likes Keira.
Poppy interrupted her loudly.
Likes her? Look what Mr. J does for you. That's what people do for someone they like.
Poppy turned toward Jake Horton, flattering him.
I heard that yesterday they couldn't free up any ward at all. There are many families with decent background who want to get into the hospital, but all of them have to wait in line. It was Mr. Jake who helped us out. That's how Mrs. Olson got into the VIP ward.
Jake Horton glanced at Keira and smiled humbly.
"My uncle doesn't know about this matter. He would have helped if he knew. I just did what little I could."
Your little contribution has been of great help to our home.
Poppy turned to Keira and mocked her again.
"Even if Mr. Olson knew, he wouldn't care about you, no matter how hard you try to please him. He's just toying with you like any Tom, Dick, or Harry."
Keira clenched her fists, but didn't want to argue here to avoid disturbing Mrs. Olson's rest. Lewis, who had just arrived, stood outside the ward and heard everything. His face was stone cold, and he cast a glance at Tom. Tom took the hint immediately. He cleared his throat and entered the room.
"Mrs. Olson, I'm here to convey Mr. Horton's regards. How are you finding the ward? Is it comfortable?"
Chapter 32. Test the Medicine. The room instantly fell silent. Everyone simultaneously turned to look at Tom, then at Jake. Jake looked dumbfounded. Was this ward arranged by his uncle? Poppy was also stunned, but quickly regained her composure and laughed.
Mr. Jake, I didn't know you asked Mr. Horton to give us this room.
Jake's expression froze. However, Tom smiled.
"Mrs. Olson asked Mr. Horton for this room. Mr. Jake, did you also go to Mr. Horton?"
Jake felt like crawling into a hole in embarrassment. He stuttered.
"I made a lot of calls at the time and asked several people for help. They said they would help. It was a misunderstanding."
Isla felt humiliated. She clenched her fists tightly, and for the first time, she didn't find Jake all that aloof. The strange atmosphere was finally broken by Mrs. Olson, who coughed a few times and said to Tom,
Please thank Mr. Horton for me. We're very comfortable here. Once I get better, I'll visit old Mrs. Horton.
Tom said,
As long as you are comfortable here, Miss Olsen won't be worried, and old Mrs. Horton will be happy.
All the businessmen could infer the implied favoritism toward Keira. This realization made everyone in the room feel slightly uneasy. They didn't expect old Mrs. Horton to favor Keira so much. Only Mrs. Olson was genuinely happy. With Keira living alone outside, she had always been anxious. But since their relationship was rather delicate, she couldn't appear to be too close to Keira. Now that old Mrs. Horton sincerely cared for Keira, Mrs. Olson could finally relax. Keira was slightly surprised. She hadn't expected Louis would help her. She looked at Poppy with a hint of mockery playing on her lips. Infuriated by her expression, Poppy fumed.
Little brat, what are you proud of? Just because you have a patron doesn't make you any better.
Shut up.
Taylor said angrily.
My wife needs to rest. What are you blabbering about? Get your ass back home.
Poppy stopped talking and seemed a little hurt.
Taylor,
Leave.
Poppy's face flushed red. She glared resentfully at Keira before leaving the room. After she left, Keira turned to Mrs. Olson.
Ma'am, how did you sleep last night?
Upon hearing this, Mrs. Olson unconsciously gripped the small medicine bottle hidden under the blanket and said slowly,
I slept very well. It has been a long time since I've slept this comfortably.
I'm glad to hear that.
Keira didn't explain much, but only nodded.
I'll let you rest.
All right.
As Keira and Tom left the room, they saw Louis standing in the hallway. He was in a formal attire, which accentuated his long legs, making him look both gentlemanly and unapproachable. He leaned against the wall and was looking down at his phone. His black hair partially covered his sharp eyebrows and eyes. His side profile, illuminated by the light, appeared defined and cold. Upon hearing them, he turned his head. His narrowed eyes seemed icy. He said,
Grandmother insisted that I come to check up on you.
Despite his indifferent tone, his deep voice warmed Keira's heart. She smiled sincerely.
Thank you.
Her amorous eyes were clear and dazzling, filled with innocence and an unintentional charm. The smile on her lips was even more breathtaking, momentarily dazzling Louis. At that moment, Jake's voice came from inside.
Auntie, since you're okay, I'll let you rest.
Sure, Ella. So Jake out.
The door opened and Jake and Isla came out. They instantly noticed Louis and Keira. Isla felt as if an enemy was approaching. Her gaze darted between the two as if trying to figure out their relationship. Jake's face darkened too. He subconsciously asked,
Uncle, what are you doing here?
Louis said meaningfully,
I don't think I need to report my whereabouts to you.
Such an indifferent reply seemed to bring an invisible pressure. Jake's palms immediately started to sweat.
That's not what I meant.
He took a deep breath and looked at Keira. Her face had a kind of unabashed beauty. Louis was also a good-looking man. When the two stood together, they were like a match made in heaven. A strong sense of jealousy overwhelmed Jake, and he couldn't help but speak again.
Miss Olson, you've been looking after my great-grandmother in the hospital all this time. Doesn't your husband mind?
Keira was taken aback. She subconsciously glanced at Mr. Horton and said with a smirk,
He probably doesn't mind.
Jake's expression changed drastically. Before he could say anything, Louis suddenly said,
Are you coming back to the ward? Grandma is waiting for you.
Coming back? Keira hesitated slightly. It had been a long time since she had heard that expression, because she had no home to come back to. Looking down, she smiled faintly.
Let's go.
The two left together. Jake's gaze was dark as he stared at Keira from behind. For a moment, he felt an urge to take her back at all costs. But Isla held his arm and said,
Jake, I promise I'll help you get Dr. South assistance.
Jake seemed to regain his senses.
All right.
I'll walk you downstairs.
Okay.
After he left, Isla felt a deep sense of crisis. When she returned to the ward, she saw Mrs. Olson getting up and moving around. Her eyes flickered. She walked to the bed and pretended to tidy up the bedspread before exclaiming,
Mom, why is there a bottle of medicine on your bed?
Taylor frowned.
Isn't this the non-warranty medicine that Keira gave you? Shirley, why did you pick it up again?
Mrs. Olson explained.
I took one last night, and it seemed to work.
How's that possible? It was clearly the sleeping pill that worked.
Taylor snatched the bottle and said dismissively,
Who knows where she got the medicine from? How can you just take it? Aren't you afraid it'll harm your health?
Mrs. Olson hurriedly said,
Don't throw it away. I won't take it tonight. I want to see which medicine works.
Taylor said reluctantly.
All right.
Soon it was night. Aunt South held the sleeping pill in her hand, looking as if she was holding a magic panacea. After seeing Mrs. Olson take it, she turned off the light and quietly left the room. The room quieted down. Half an hour later, there was still no sound inside. Aunt South said excitedly,
Mr. Jake's medicine is a lifesaver for Mrs. Olson. She hasn't had a full night's sleep in over 20 years.
Isla pretended to be shy.
Don't say that. The ward wasn't arranged by Jake, and it was such a big embarrassment today.
Upon hearing this, Taylor said,
Compared to the ward, this medicine is the most important. Even if Shirley were in the presidential suit, she wouldn't be able to sleep without it. Keira went out of her way to seek for Mr. Davis's help to show off and brag. What? Are we supposed to be grateful and indebted to her?
After that, he glanced in disgust at the bottle of medicine Keira had sent.
Aunt South, get rid of this stupid medicine. Don't let Shirley take it again.
As soon as he said those words, a suppressed, severe coughing sound came from the ward. Chapter 33. Keira is Dr. South? Taylor was slightly startled. He exchanged a glance with Aunt South and immediately rushed into the ward. One of the characteristics of a nervous cough was that it tended to get worse at night. Aunt South switched on the light. Everyone could see Mrs. Olson sitting halfway up in bed, her hand covering her mouth, her face red from the effort of coughing. She clutched her chest. Her frail body trembled violently with each cough. The sight was alarming. Taylor steadied her by the shoulder.
Shirley, are you all right?
But Mrs. Olson said,
Medicine.
Then she coughed again. Taylor was puzzled. Aunt South, however, understood and immediately rushed out to bring in the medicine bottle given by Keira.
Mrs. Olson, the medicine's here.
Mrs. Olson nodded, and as Aunt South anxiously opened the bottle and was about to hand her a tablet, her hand was stopped by Isla. Isla frowned and said,
Mom's cough suddenly worsened. Could it have been caused by this medicine? I think it's better not to take medicine with an unknown origin.
Her intuition told her that the medicine might actually work. That's why she couldn't let Mrs. Olson take it. She looked at Taylor. When someone is prejudiced against another, everything the latter did seemed wrong. Keira was the daughter of Poppy, and that was Taylor's biggest prejudice against her. As expected, Taylor said angrily,
Keira is always causing more harm than good. I've always said that she's unreliable. Despite your kindness to her, Shirley, she tries to harm you with this medicine.
Isla's heart leaped in satisfaction. Mrs. Olson, however, seized a momentary relief from her cough and looked to Aunt South.
Give me the medicine.
Aunt South, ever so loyal, immediately handed the tablet to Mrs. Olson, who promptly put it in her mouth.
Shirley!
As Taylor yelled in alarm and tried to stop her, he realized Mrs. Olson had stopped coughing. She took a deep breath after her fit of coughing subsided and then looked at them seriously.
It's confirmed. It's Keira's medicine that worked.
When Mrs. Olson's coughing finally stopped and she fell asleep, the others all came out to the outer room again. Isla's face was pale. She bit her lip and said,
Dad, is Keira really so capable that she actually managed to find an effective medicine?
What capability does she have? It must have been Mr. Horton who helped her buy it.
Taylor frowned.
It seems old Mrs. Horton really does favor her.
Isla immediately clenched her fists. In the VIP ward,
What did we eat for lunch today?
the old lady racked her brain.
Oatmeal? No, it was pasta. Brat, am I right?
Lewis nodded with a smile.
Correct.
The old lady was pleased.
I know I don't have any problems. My brain works fine.
Lewis didn't say anything. Upon closer inspection, one could tell that his eyes didn't mirror his smile. In fact, they had rice for lunch. His grandmother had forgotten again. Her condition seemed to be worsening, and her memory began to degenerate. At this moment, Keira suddenly said,
Grandma, what color was Miss Horton's tie yesterday?
The old lady immediately said,
Purple. This brat is very particular. He even wore diamond cufflinks.
And the day before yesterday?
Blue. I bought him that blue tie.
Keira smiled lightly and looked meaningfully at Lewis.
Grandma remembers the things she cares about very clearly.
Lewis looked at her. She was sitting in the recliner, sinking deeply into it. She was lazily playing with her phone. With her head lowered, her long black hair casually draped over her back, accentuating her fair skin and giving her an overall soft glow. What she just said was intended to comfort him. His anxiety gradually subsided. The old lady suddenly chuckled.
Granddaughter-in-law. I was right, wasn't I?
Keira said.
Yes.
The old lady then looked at Lewis.
Brat, did you see that? Your wife even remembers clearly what you wear every day. She's thinking about you all the time.
Keira was shocked. She merely has a photographic memory. She really didn't intentionally remember these things. She wanted to explain something, but noticed that Lewis was staring at the computer in front of him, completely ignoring them. He must have not taken the old woman's words to heart, right? In that case, she wouldn't explain to avoid seeming overly defensive. Keira didn't notice the slight redness on his earlobes and once again focused on her work. The finishing touches of Alzheimer's research, a problem that had her utterly stumped. She rose to her feet.
I'm going for a walk.
Just as she was about to take the Shiba Inu kitten for a stroll, someone lightly tapped her shoulder. She turned around to see a middle-aged man with a rowdy appearance standing behind her, grinning.
Niece, long time no see.
Kira's face darkened. This man was Poppy's brother, her uncle, Finley Hill. He was jobless and thoroughly addicted to gambling. He spoke with a foul breath, and his yellow, rotten teeth made her nauseous. Keira took a step back.
What are you here for?
Finley rubbed his hands and said sleazily,
Oh my, I hear my dear niece has gotten into a good grace of the Horton family. I'm a bit tight on cash lately. Could you lend me some money?
Keira sneered. Poppy was extremely devoted to her brother. She squatted in the Olsen's house without leaving and gave all the living expenses provided by the Olsen to this brother of hers. After Keira left the Olsen family, Finley had shamelessly gone to see her several times for money. Later, presumably seeing that she really had no money, he finally backed off. Who would have thought he'd show up again now? Keira said,
I have no money.
Finley didn't believe her.
You served that old woman so well and she hasn't given you any money?
Keira narrowed her eyes.
Not yet. Maybe she will in the future.
Finley immediately laughed.
Then you must lend me some money when you get it. If you give me enough, I can tell you a secret.
Fine.
Finley didn't dare to make a fuss here. After all, the VIP ward was inhabited by either the rich or the powerful. With security patrolling nearby, he chuckled and left. Keira gave a snort of derision. Just then, her phone rang. She took it out to see that it was Mrs. Olson. She quickly answered the call. Isla was anxiously pacing the room. She was relying on Dr. South to secure her position in the Horton family, but Dr. South hadn't replied to Mrs. Olson's messages all day today. Jake had sent a few more WhatsApp messages, persistently asking about Dr. South. Isla couldn't keep stalling. Isla suddenly stopped in her tracks and quietly entered the ward. Mrs. Olson was fast asleep, so Isla took the phone from her mother. She then went outside to the corridor. She took a deep breath, unlocked the phone, found South in the contacts, and dialed the number. The call was answered after 3 rings. The person on the other end answered with a clear voice.
Hello, Mrs. Orson. What can I do for you?
Upon hearing this voice, Isla froze. That voice was...
Keira?
Chapter 34. Nonsense. Isla's eyes widened in disbelief as she stared at her mother's phone. She wouldn't mistake that voice. The voice on the other end of the phone paused slightly. Then it turned colder still.
Ella, what are you doing with Mrs. Orson's phone?
It was her. Isla felt as if she had seen a ghost. No, it couldn't be. She glanced at her phone sharply, suddenly thinking of something. She asked,
Is this your phone number?
Keira said.
What kind of question is that?
That's when it dawned on Isla. She almost forgot that Kira's nickname was also South, which was what Mrs. Olson would sometimes call her. A tremendous sigh of relief escaped her lips, followed by boundless fury.
You're such a sycophant! To get my mom's favor, you even put her family name in your nickname. Are you worthy of being called that?
Keira lowered her eyes. The name was something she had chosen when she was in elementary school. South indeed came from Mrs. Olson's maiden name. Keira was young at the time and chose it simply because she liked it, never thinking about whether it would bother Mrs. Olson. She was the daughter of a mistress, yet she adopted the wife's last name. Keira wondered what Mrs. Olson felt at the time. She would never know now. She said indifferently,
Did you call just to say this?
Of course not.
Isla tore off her mask of decency and said viciously,
I just want to tell you, even if you've charmed Mr. Horton through old Mrs. Horton, you are nothing more than a mistress and a toy. Mr. Horton is a married man. I'm different though. I'll marry Jake and become a legitimate daughter-in-law of the Horton family.
Keira said.
Then, congratulations.
Isla felt as if she was punching cotton. She left a threat in the end.
You can't just talk about feelings in a wealthy family. I have connections with Dr. South. I'll always be in an unbeatable position.
Kira's mouth twitched after the phone call. Since when had she become one of Isla's pawns? As she pondered, a WhatsApp call came in again. This time it was from Mrs. Olson. She was calling Dr. South on WhatsApp. Keira operated on her phone, picked it up, and said casually,
Hello?
Her voice was changed by a device. The appearance of Finley made her understand that some things were better kept low-key to avoid unwelcome relatives. Isla said respectfully,
Hello, Dr. South. Sorry for the disturbance. I'm Isla Olson, the daughter of Mrs. Olson. I'm calling on the Horton Group's behalf. They would like to invite you to join their R&D team. Oh, my mother also wishes for the same. So, may I ask if you could...
Not interested.
Keira interrupted her coldly. Isla halted. She wanted to say something more, but Keira said,
I only take responsibility for companies under Mrs. Orson's name.
Monday. Keira left her puppy with the old lady and dutifully went to work. As she stepped out of the hospital gate, contemplating whether to take a taxi or the subway, a Bentley slowly stopped beside her. Lewis looked straight ahead, saying indifferently,
Get in.
Keira refused.
I don't think I should do that.
The two weren't on such good terms yet. Louis said,
Grandma asked me to drive you to work.
You could just tell her you did that.
Louis glanced at her.
I need a photo for proof.
Fine.
Keira opened the back door and sat next to Louis. Louis raised his phone and took a selfie of the two of them. Keira posed with her 2 fingers raised and a sweet smile. She tilted her head and a few strands of her hair fluttered across Louis's face, leaving him rigid, like he was electrocuted for a moment. In the passenger seat, Tom hesitated for a moment. He didn't recall old Mrs. Horton making this request before they left. He must have missed it. After taking the photo, Keira sat up straight and started busying herself on her phone. The two remained silent until they reached the underground parking lot of the Horton Group. Louis took the exclusive elevator and left with Tom. Keira, on the other hand, took the staff elevator up to the R&D department. At this time, the managerial staff of the R&D department were in a tense meeting. The general manager of the R&D department announced a position change.
After the decision of the company's top management, Jake, the team leader, is promoted to be the vice president, who will be responsible for the technical issues of the R&D department in the future.
Why is this announcement so sudden?
The manager said,
Vice President Horton successfully invited Dr. South to be our technical support in the R&D department. This is a big deal for the R&D department. Although Dr. South doesn't work in the office, if any of you have any problems, you can ask Vice President Horton to communicate with him and solve the problem. Now, let's have Vice President Horton to say a few words.
Jake stood up and spoke directly.
From now on, the research and development staff of the first and second teams have to listen to my commands. Mr. Riley, I presume you won't violate the company's regulation?
Jalen, who had been working overtime all weekend at the company and had pulled 2 all-nighters, was wearing casual clothes with an air of irritation. He snorted coldly.
There's another regulation of the company that doesn't allow skipping ranks, reporting, or assigning tasks. So, about my staff, you can only delegate tasks through me.
Jake's face darkened.
Mr. Riley, I see you don't have enough energy to manage the staff of the first team. Have you solved your core problem yet? Although the R&D department is divided into teams, it's also a whole. Your delays affect the process of the entire project.
Jalen abruptly stood up.
You also study renewable energy, so you should know how difficult the research is. You make it sound like you can solve my core problem.
Jake spoke calmly.
I cannot solve it, but I have someone who can. Do you need me to ask Dr. South for help?
Jalen scoffed.
I don't know you could be so kind.
Jake's eyes were filled with a cold light.
We're all in the R&D team, so of course, I'll show extra care. But I need one of your team's technical staff to come over and assist me. How about that new intern? Deal?
Jalen knew from the start that he was after Keira. He said coldly,
No deal. I'll do it myself slowly. Don't bother asking Dr. South for me.
Jake said gloomily,
Mr. Riley, don't think that hiding behind my uncle can help you do as you please here. You're responsible for delaying the entire R&D department's progress. I'll give you 2 more days. If you don't solve that problem, I'm going to request your dismissal or demotion.
Jalen walked out.
Then let's see if you're capable of that.
He was arrogant in the office, but once he stepped outside, Jalen lost his composure. He knew even if Louis wanted to protect him, if Jake really put forward a request, it would be troublesome. Jailard entered the first team section of the R&D department and kicked a chair angrily. Luca was late for work. He quietly went to his workstation, afraid of causing trouble with his agitated team leader. He turned on his computer, opened his inbox, and saw an unread email. Huh? An email from Keira. Did she really solve the core problem? Chapter 35. Solution. Seriously? Even Jalen, a PhD who returned to the country after studying abroad, couldn't solve such a core issue immediately. Keira was only an undergraduate. Even if Professor Miller praised her talent, could she solve it no matter how well she defied expectations? Luca thought those things as he clicked the mouse. He opened that email and then he blinked. Bang! Jalen slammed the documents he held onto the table and raised his chin slightly.
Meeting time.
Luca didn't respond immediately. Instead, he was staring at that email.
Luca, is your butt glued to the chair?
Jalen was in a bad mood, and seeing Luca moving slowly, he shouted angrily. Luca glanced at the content of the email, saw that it was a blank file, and immediately stood up.
Coming, I'm coming.
Keira failed to solve the problem, but she had probably sent this email by mistake. When he left his computer, the attachment that had just finished buffering in the email was lying quietly in the interface. In the office, Jalen frowned and briefly explained the situation at the just concluded meeting. He didn't mention Keira and just said,
In 2 days, if the core issue cannot be solved, I'll resign.
The moment these words came out, the office became quiet. Jalen did have a temper and often scolded them, but he was a qualified team leader and they all respected him. After a while of silence, everyone started talking.
Jalen, just tell us what to do.
Yes, for the next 2 days, we won't sleep. Let's do our best.
Jalen delegated work, increasing each employee's workload several times, yet nobody complained. It was only after the meeting that Jalen felt like he had forgotten something. He suddenly turned to Luca.
Where's Keira?
How come she wasn't at work yet? Luca shook his head, but another person said,
She came in the morning, clocked in, and then went to the library.
The complexion on Jalen's face instantly turned gloomy. He was struggling against Jake for her, but that woman had gone out again? Someone couldn't help saying,
Jalen, she's too ungrateful. If she worked with us on this project, she would gain so much work experience.
Luca didn't agree with Keira's approach, but still spoke for her.
She just graduated from college. She doesn't understand these things. Besides, our stuff is too complicated for her. She probably won't understand.
We're a team. Even if she doesn't understand, she should still stay and help at the key moment, right? Is she taking a salary and not working? Who does that?
That's right. What's wrong with the girl? And our team beginning to keep loafers?
Jalen took a deep breath, feeling that Keira was ungrateful. On the roof, Tom had been keeping an eye on the situation below and knew more about it than Group 1. He was complaining to Lewis.
Jalen is working frantically for her while and she is leisurely reading in the library all morning. She is real a femme fatale.
Lewis frowned, his cool, scrutinizing eyes glancing at Tom.
Reading all morning?
Yes, she clocked in and went there. She hasn't even had lunch yet.
What book?
I didn't pay attention to that. I assume it's a paper on new energy.
You assume?
The clear displeasure in Lewis's voice gave Tom a chill, but he suddenly realized something.
She's been targeting the library since she started working, so her purpose in joining Horton Group is to search for information?
What book she was reading became hugely important. Tom bowed his head.
I will find it out.
But Lewis had already stood up. He was buttoning his blazer as he walked briskly out, only leaving a word behind.
Don't bother.
He quickly arrived at the library and found her among the books in the neurology category. She was looking up, her eyes swiftly sweeping across a row of books, then coming to rest at the highest level of the shelf. She then saw something. She dragged over a ladder, climbed up, and reached for the book. She was wearing a loose hooded sweatshirt today, along with skinny jeans. Her movement raised the lower hem of her sweatshirt, revealing her leg. From Lewis's perspective, her legs were slender and straight, and her jeans wrapped around the pretty curves of her derriere, above which was her fair waist. Lewis paused and slowly looked away. Her fair waist seemed to be imprinted on his brain and sparked a thought in his mind.
Her waist is so thin that I can wrap my hand around it.
Keira didn't notice him. After getting the book, she casually flipped through it, and her eyes suddenly lit up. The book she wanted to find was this one. Overjoyed, she momentarily forgot she was still on the ladder and stepped forward as if she wanted to go to the seat next to her, but her foot missed the step and she lost her balance. Now she was in trouble. Just as Keira thought of this, she fell into the warm and strong arms of someone. It was only then she realized that Louis caught her. The two were very close, and she could smell his vanilla fragrance. His large hand was holding her butt, and the burning heat from his palm went through her thin jeans. Keira's heart suddenly skipped a beat, and she felt so embarrassed. But she understood that he didn't mean to do that. It was just a coincidence. Keira hastily jumped down, calming herself down.
Miss Horton. Thank you.
She blushed a little. Louis paused, subconsciously looking at his empty hand. She was so light and soft. The touch just now made him suddenly feel a bit parched. He had been running the business for years, but for the first time, he felt a little at loss. He lowered his gaze, his eyelashes slightly trembling. He controlled himself and said,
You're welcome.
There was a moment of awkward silence. Keira cleared her throat.
I just remembered I had something to do in the R&D department. I need to go back.
Okay.
With Louis's permission, Keira quickly hid the book she just found in a corner out of sight, worried someone else might borrow it, then left the library. By the time she reached the elevator, her face was still burning a little. Keira casually grabbed something to eat and returned to Groupon in the research department. As soon as she entered, she noticed something was wrong right away. The colleagues, who were originally quite friendly toward her, now seemed like they didn't like her. Keira didn't understand and just thought everyone was not familiar with her. In the afternoon, she went to the library again, but she was stopped by Luca, who said in a low voice,
Don't go in the afternoon.
Why?
Keira was puzzled.
Didn't they say that as long as my own work is done, I can go?
Luca immediately looked around and indeed saw the odd looks from his colleagues. He too started to become impatient and said bitterly,
Yes, once the work is done, you can go, but have you finished the work I assigned you last week?
Yes, it's done.
I know it's difficult and you can't solve it overnight, so you need to stay here and... Wait, what?